Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Baker Institute this evening to discuss the critical role of the White House Chief of Staff. The President's Chief of Staff holds one of the most central and challenging positions in Washington. The Chief of Staff is responsible for directing a complex organizational structure, for communicating and pushing the President's agenda, and in many ways, for managing the President's relationship with actors inside and outside of the White House. Chris Whipple has correctly called the Chief of Staff a gatekeeper, controlling who sees and does not see the President. Importantly, the Chief of Staff must be a traffic cop, managing flows of people and information to ensure the President's domestic and foreign policy priorities are achieved. Our speakers tonight are very familiar, obviously, with this role, its importance and its challenges, albeit in different ways. Secretary Baker served as Chief of Staff to Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, in addition to serving as Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of State. We have his cabinet chair in his office here, and it has 4 plaques on the back of it. Not many people have that. And he often accuses me of always sitting there because I have delusions of grandeur. Chris Whipple is an award-winning writer, documentary filmmaker, journalist, and producer of 60 Minutes and ABC's Primetime. His newly released book, The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency, examines the historical importance of the Chief of Staff and the President's legacy. In writing the book, he spoke with 17 chiefs about the inner workings of the White House and the role the Chief of Staff plays. The book is available after the event for signature and sale after our event here. So after their discussion, our speakers will take questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Secretary James A. Baker III and Chris Whipple.
Ambassador, thank you for that introduction. It's can't tell you what a privilege it is to be here with James Baker on my book tour. This is undoubtedly the highlight of the tour. I think it's really refreshing that in an era of toxic partisanship, where no one seems to agree with anyone about anything, that there's a bipartisan consensus on one thing, and that is that James A. Baker III was the gold standard as White House Chief of Staff.
I probably ought to respond to that by saying you can fool some of the people some of the time.
Well, we'll get to that a little bit later. Whenever a White House Chief of Staff starts the job, sometimes before he starts the job, and they've all been men so far, someday that will change. But the first thing they do, if they're smart, is they call James Baker for advice. And the first thing he usually tells them is, congratulations, you've got the worst blanking job in government. It is grueling, it is thankless, you get all of the blame and none of the credit, and the burnout rate is high. But I want to begin by talking about, I do tell the story in my book about how Jim Baker got the job. And you said it was the most unbelievable thing that happened to you in your life was being chosen as Ronald Reagan's Chief of Staff. Why and how did it happen?
Well, particularly after running 2 campaigns against Governor Reagan first, and then I started to say President-elect Reagan. No, Governor Reagan, 2 campaigns against him. Then for him to turn to me to be his Chief of Staff, you had to pick me up off the floor with a blotter. I never expected that, and I don't think anybody else ever expected it. And I'm not sure, Chris, that will ever happen again in American politics, where a president-elect turns to someone who's run 2 campaigns against him. Why did they turn to me? Well, I think it was a number of reasons, perhaps. Number one, I knew Washington. I knew how Washington worked. I'd been close to the Ford administration and the Ford White House. That was one of the campaigns I ran against Governor Reagan, was to deny him the nomination, Republican nomination in 1976, working for Jerry Ford. And they wanted somebody who understood Washington, understood the dynamics and what you had to do. And I think that's why they turned to me. It was primarily three people who convinced the president that he ought to take a look at me and then make up his own mind as to whether or not he wanted me to be his White House Chief of Staff. First of all, Nancy Reagan. Secondly, Stuart Spencer, who had been Governor Reagan's political guru and then President Reagan's political guru for a long time. And lastly, Mike Deaver, who was a staffer in the governor's office in California and was probably the closest staff person to the Reagans personally.
Yeah.
And these are the three people that originally made the suggestion. What they really did was, during the campaign, in the latter weeks of the campaign in 1980, they put me on the airplane so that the Reagans would get to know me a little better. And not that I needed to get to know them any better. I'd run 2 campaigns against him. I knew him pretty well.
Well, your rival for influence with Ronald Reagan was Ed Meese, who had been Ronald Reagan's chief of staff in Sacramento.
Correct.
And the story that Stu Spencer told me was that I think it was the day after the election. Spencer went to Ronald Reagan and Nancy. It was in their hotel suite, I believe. And he said, "Governor, the word on the street is your chief of staff is going to be Ed Meese. And that's not a great idea." And Reagan said to him, "Oh, no. Ed's not organized." The story about Ed Meese was that his suitcase was a black hole. His briefcase was a black hole. Papers went in and they never came out. True story?
It didn't happen the day after the election. It happened about maybe 10 days or so before the election.
Okay.
They said, he went to the president. He said, "Mr. President, I think you're going to win this." I said, "Governor, I think you're going to win this thing, and you better be thinking about who you want as chief of staff." And that's when they suggested me.
And then President-elect Reagan, as I understand it, said to you, "Now I want you to make it right with it."
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
Well, the morning after the election, he said, no, the night of the election night, we're celebrating in the Century Plaza Hotel in LA, and the president-elect comes up to me and said, "Jim, before you go back to Texas, I want to see you tomorrow." And Susan started crying when I told her that, because she knew something was coming. And so I went and met with him, and he said, "I'd like you, Jim, to be my White House Chief of Staff, but I want you to make it right with Ed." Because everyone expected that Ed would be the Chief of Staff, and probably including Ed and others. And so he'd been very valuable to and I need to interject here, Chris, that Ed Meese is an extraordinarily good friend of mine. We had a lot of competitive tensions in that first term White House, but we always got along well as individuals and personally. And I have, since that time, recruited Ed to be on the Iraq study group and on the federal, that I co-chaired with Lee Hamilton, and on the federal election Reform Commission that I co-chaired, I think, with on the War Powers Commission that I co-chaired with Warren Christopher. And he and I are still close. He and his wife Ursula and Susan and I are still close today. So there's a real friendship there. But everybody expected that Ed would be the Chief of Staff. And so I called him right after that meeting with the president-elect, and I said, Ed, let's go downstairs, and he'd learned by then what was going to happen. I said, let's go down and talk about how we might work this out. And we went down and had breakfast. And we started talking about relative responsibilities and what each of us would do. And we drew up a little one-page memo that it had 2 columns, Meese responsibilities, Baker responsibilities. And that's how we worked it out. And Ed was interested in policy. He was an extraordinarily good policy synthesizer for Ronald Reagan. He could explain to him in very concise and understandable terms the most difficult most complicated policy matters. And so he got the Domestic Policy Council supervision over the NSC. At that time, the NSC advisor, the National Security Advisor, had to report through Ed. And he was made a counselor to the president with cabinet rank, and I was Chief of Staff of the White House, and I had jurisdiction over all of the elements that made the White House run, political, communications, policy, politics, and Congress.
But the bottom line here that he's too modest to tell you is that Ed Meese got a lot of fancy titles, and Jim Baker got everything that mattered, which was the gatekeeper for the president, the person who controlled the information flow, the role of honest broker for Ronald Reagan, and the person who executed the president's agenda. And correct?
Well, correct to the point that they weren't all of the important elements. You are right in terms of controlling the paper flow into the president, although we worked out an arrangement where 3 of us in that White House had walk-in rights to the Oval. So I wasn't a gatekeeper in that respect. But we also agreed with each other that we would try to keep the others involved on anything we talked to them about. But the most important thing that I had was the implementation function and the elements of the White House that made it run and function. Yeah,
and one of the stories that I tell in the book, and it's full of fascinating characters. It's a cast of characters that Aaron Sorkin couldn't have dreamed up. I mean, you've beginning with H.R. Haldeman, who was Richard Nixon's chief of staff. Infamously, he was his pluperfect son of a bitch. But the irony is that he created sort of the template for the modern White House chief, which Jim Baker then took to another level. But I wonder if you think it's true. Tell me if I'm wrong, because I've been on my tour, I've been going around saying that every modern president learns, sometimes the hard way, that in order to govern effectively, you have to empower a White House chief of staff as first among equals to do all the things we've talked about, to execute the president's agenda, and maybe most importantly, tell the president what he doesn't want to hear.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I agree with you. It's important from the standpoint of having a well-oiled organization. Somebody has to be in charge of the staff. And, running a White House, running an administration is not a lot different than running a campaign. You need to have a coordinated message and a directed message, and you need to prioritize. And you can't do that when you have too many chiefs.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that the current White House has, I think, is that there are at least 5 or 6 power centers, separate power centers in that White House, and they cross-cut. They have each of them has responsibilities cross-cutting domestic policy and international policy, and they're not well-defined responsibilities, and that's sadly, in my view, a recipe for dysfunction. And I think that's going to be corrected. I think it's beginning to be corrected now, if you believe the news stories you read.
Well, we can come back to the current White House in a minute, but to me, it reminds me, we've seen this movie before, haven't we? I mean, Jerry Ford had thought he had this crazy idea that he could run the White House the way he did as minority leader in the House. He could have 5 or 6 people coming and going, just like the current White House. He called it the spokes of the wheel, with Ford at the center and all of these advisors coming and going, and it was a disaster. Within a month, he realized it was unworkable, and he brought in, guess who, a guy named Donald Rumsfeld, a pretty tough taskmaster, who really turned that White House around, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then Dick Cheney following him.
And Cheney, it became an in-joke in the Ford White House, this unworkable system called spokes of the wheel. And on Dick Cheney's last day as White House Chief of Staff, the staff brought him a present. He unwrapped it, and it was a mangled bicycle wheel with every spoke broken. Cheney loved it. But instead of taking it home and putting it in the garage, he propped it up on his desk for his successor, Hamilton Jordan, who was coming in as Jimmy Carter's de facto chief of staff, because Carter didn't actually appoint one. And he wrote a note saying, "Dear Ham, beware the spokes of the wheel."
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think that, tell us about speaking truth to power with Ronald Reagan. You and Leon Panetta, who I think was an exceptional chief of staff for Bill Clinton, agree on one thing, that is maybe the most important thing you do.
It's very, very important. It really is. And if you're not secure enough in your role, if the president hasn't empowered you sufficiently that you can do that and give him advice that you know he doesn't want to hear, you're not going to be very good as his chief of staff, and you're not going to be very valuable to him. So it's an extremely important attribute of that job. I'll tell you something that my pal George Bush wrote about me. Of course, he and I had been friends for 40 years, and I had run all of his political campaigns. He was my daughter's godfather and everything. But one of the things he wrote in his book said, the one thing that I like about Jim Baker, not the one thing, but one of the things I like the most about Jim Baker.
The only thing you like.
There may be only one thing. One of the things I like most about Jim Baker is he'll tell me what I don't want to hear. He'll tell me what he knows I don't want to hear, even though he knows I don't want to hear it. So that's really important. And it was important, more important in my case with Reagan, because I wasn't quite that close to Reagan. I could talk to President Bush as sort of a contemporary or colleague, but you have to be able to do that. And there you have instances in your book on the chapter there that covers my service to Reagan, where I did speak truth.
Tell us about his idea about Social Security, Reagan.
Well, there were a couple of instances. Another was when he ordered an investigation of a leak out of a National Security Council meeting. Was going to have everybody strapped up to a lie detector test. And we went on both those occasions. Social Security, we were in there. We hadn't been in there, I don't think, more than 2 or 3 months. And we were focused with laser-like efficiency on our economic program. And by the way, that's something that's really important, is prioritization. You got so many things coming at you in the White House. If you don't prioritize, particularly if it's something you have to get through the Congress. And as a matter of fact, the way we judge our presidents in this country is on the basis of how much of their program they were able to get through the Congress. So it's really important to do that. But we'd been there about 2 or 3 weeks. We were working on our economic program. It was coming along pretty well. And Dick Schweiker, who was Secretary of HHS, had been a senator from Pennsylvania. And David Stockman, who was the OMB director, came with an idea that they wanted to reform Social Security. Well, Social Security at that time, and probably to a large degree today, was the third rail of politics. You touch it, you get electrocuted, particularly if you're a Republican. And I saw that come past my desk with great horror, and I said, wait a minute, we can't do this. But the president wanted to do it. It was something it needed reforming, and by the way, we ended up reforming it, but not until late in 1983 when we appointed a commission to do it that would take a little bit of and got Tip O'Neill to go along with us, so that it was a joint bipartisan effort. And the commission meant it wasn't just a Ronald Reagan thing, it was a bipartisan commission suggestion. And I had to tell him, I said, we can't do this, we're not going to do this.
And Reagan didn't want to hear that advice.
He didn't want to hear that.
But ultimately he heard it and he took it.
Yeah,
and as a result,
we got it done finally, but we did it in a way that didn't cost us the office politically.
But in large part because you were able to change course, or persuade him to change course with help from Nancy and others. He made the pivot to tax cuts, right? And the rest is history.
Well, we just kept the focus on our tax reductions and spending reductions.
Yeah. So let's fast forward now to the current day, because I wonder if there might not be a parallel here in terms of priorities and in terms of knowing how to run the White House. Ken Duberstein calls the role the president's reality therapist. You tell him what's doable and what's not. You famously had something called the Legislative Strategy Group with a bunch of very bright people like Richard Darman, the congressional liaison, Ken Duberstein. Those guys knew how to count votes.
That's right.
I've been saying on several stops on my tour that I couldn't imagine Jim Baker as chief of staff signing off on the notion of pursuing repeal and replace Obamacare when it was obvious from the get-go that the votes were not there and the bill was incoherent. Am I right?
Well, I don't know whether I would or not, because I didn't look at it and I wasn't there, but I will say this. We didn't send anything up to the Hill unless we had a very clear strategy for how we were going to get it passed, particularly if it was our number one priority. You have to prioritize. I said a minute ago that when we first came in, we focused with laser-like intensity on the economy and the tax reductions and spending cuts. And we were so focused on that for the first 100+ days that we fought the State Department and the Defense Department and others who wanted to have National Security Council meetings, and we'd say no, our focus is going to be on our economic program. And you really have to prioritize. I'll tell you one little anecdote. We're in a early National Security Council meeting, and the president's new, and the cabinet's all sitting around the table. And the way these National Security Council meetings go, normally you have the first presentations from the intelligence community. So President Reagan calls on Bill Casey to give the intelligence assessment, and Bill Casey, we used to call him Mumbles, because nobody could ever understand what he was saying. And he sat there and he was going mum, 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 mum. And President Reagan turned to Howard Baker, who was majority leader, and he said, "You know, Howard," he said, "I've never been able to understand Bill." And Howard Baker said, "Mr. President, that's the scariest thing I've ever heard of." I'm sorry for the digression, but that's a great story.
Let's go back to another great story, another great character among the 17 living White House chiefs that I researched. This one actually no longer living. Donald Reagan.
Yeah.
This had to be the most disastrous job swap in American political history. Jim Baker, after 4 years as White House Chief of Staff, was burned out. Desperate to move on and take a new role. And one day, Don Regan, the then Treasury Secretary, said, "Why don't we swap jobs," right? Nancy Reagan's usually infallible antenna for personnel decisions failed her in this case, correct? What happened?
In retrospect, it did, but you got to remember that when President Reagan asked me to take the job initially, back there at the Century Plaza, I said I'm honored. I will try to make it right with Ed. But this job, Mr. President, is best done in 2-year increments because you use up your political chits. The job is one of catching javelins that are intended for the president. And you walk around with a target painted on your front and on your back. And your political chits run out pretty quickly. And so President Reagan said, fine, okay, Jim, we'll do it. So 2 weeks it was going to be right, and after 2 years, after 4 years, and 1 month and 2 weeks, I was still there. So when Reagan said we ought to change jobs, I said, don't make that suggestion again, Don, because if the president would agree to it, I might take you up on it. And what he really wanted, he wanted the power of the job. And you are the second most powerful person in Washington, provided you remember the full title. The full title is Chief of Staff. Nancy Reagan wrote in her book that Don Regan loved the chief part of the title, but he didn't like the staff part. And the truth of the matter is, you should never have as your White House Chief of Staff someone who has been a principal in their own right. Howard Baker was there for a while when Reagan got in trouble in the Iran-contra thing, and he did a good job. But for the most part, people who come into that job from being principals in their own right don't do well, because they forget that their power is totally vicarious from the president. They don't have any power. They weren't elected to anything, and yet they don't have any power from the people, and yet they have all this power through the president. And they lose sight of that fact.
And just to give you an idea of how consequential this transition was from Jim Baker to Donald Reagan. Reagan was so imperial and so regal, by the way, that he loved to have his arrival announced when he walked into a room. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chief of Staff of the United States. Anyway, he ran afoul of, I'll get to this in a second, but what he famously said that if a sparrow lands on the front lawn of the White House, I'll know about it. But he somehow didn't notice this cockamamie scheme that was being hatched in the White House basement that became the Iran-contra scandal.
That's right.
I argue in the book that the Iran-contra scandal never would have happened on Jim Baker's watch. He would have put a stake in it. But that's...
Well, Reagan actually wrote that in his book.
Yeah.
The president wrote it.
Yeah. But Ronald Reagan believed it, and Nancy Reagan wrote that it was the worst mistake of the administration.
Yeah, but in retrospect, that's right. On the other hand, everybody was in favor of it. The president was in favor of it, Nancy was in favor of it, and the White House high-level staffers were all in favor of it. Because Don Regan had been Ronald Reagan's favorite cabinet officer. They were both Irishmen, loved to tell good Irish stories, and he was close. They were close in age. That's what Mike Deaver said when we first approached Reagan about my changing jobs with Reagan. Mike said, "Mr. President, we've got somebody your own age here that you might want to play with," or something like that. I mean, some joke like that. But everybody signed off on this, and everybody thought it was going to work. I thought it was going to work. But I didn't know that he would have come in there with it. You know, here's a guy who moves across the street from the Treasury Department, brings his own Secret Service detail with him, even though he's inside the cocoon of the president's protection. So it didn't work out.
You know what Stu Spencer's theory of Iran-contra was? That it's also in the book. Stu Spencer, again, the famous veteran campaign manager who could speak truth to presidents. So often chiefs of staff would bring Stu in to tell presidents the unvarnished truth when they were afraid to confront him. Stu Spencer said, he said, Ollie North, he was a nut John Poindexter, he had personality problems. And Casey, you couldn't understand a word he said. We called him Mumbles. I honestly believe that Mumbles went over to see Reagan one night, and Reagan had his hearing aid turned off. He said, I honestly believe that could have happened. Anyway.
So this is really beside the point, but you're talking about Stu Spencer and speaking truth to power, and he was really good at it. And so after Ford accedes to the presidency and we're running against Carter, I was the chairman of the President Ford Committee, and Stu was the political guy. Cheney was the White House Chief of Staff. And it was a real uphill fight because Ford had pardoned Nixon, and that we kept seeing that in the polling and everything. And so and Ford was not all that great a campaigner. So we came upon the strategy of what we call the Rose Garden strategy, where we'd keep Ford in the White House and present him as make him presidential, and it worked. It began to work, but Ford was chafing under the restrictions, and he said, "Why do I have to stay here in the White House? Why can't I go out and campaign and have some rallies and things?" And Stu looked at him, and I have to be careful how I say this. Stu looked at him and said, "Because, Mr. President, when the red light goes on the camera, you're no effing good."
To which apparently Gerald Ford said, "Okay." Right? So we could talk all night long. There's 50 years of history, 17 White House chiefs. We don't have that kind of time, but I want to ask you to tell another story that I think is told for the first time in the book, with help from you and Stu Spencer and Brent Scowcroft, and that is the story of the Bush 43 White House. And we're seeing a White House with factions right now at war with one another. But it's not the first time that has happened, and in the Bush 43 White House, as we all know, there was real tension and friction between a very powerful Vice President and Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, Secretary of State Colin Powell. In my chapter, I tell the story of how Jim Baker and Bush 41 were so troubled, so concerned by this, that you decided to do what? Can you tell me that story about going to see Secretary of State Powell?
Well, I didn't go to see him. I had occasion to be talking to him, and he was quite understandably complaining about what was going on. And my suggestion was, look, you need to go in. This was early on. This didn't have anything to do with the Iraq War. Okay, this was early on, and he was being undercut internally. And no Secretary of State can be effective unless he has a seamless relationship with his president. And Colin had these two guys in there shooting at him. And Dick is to this day an extraordinarily close, good personal friend of mine, and I'll tell him the same thing. But so I told Colin, I said, Colin, you just need to go in there and tell the president this is not what you signed on for. That you want to, if you're going to be his Secretary of State, you have to be the principal advisor, the principal spokesman on foreign policy matters. He was a military man, and he wasn't willing to do that.
Wasn't willing to do it.
No.
Yep. When I called up General Powell and I told him about Jim's version of events, he said, well, if Jim says he said that, I'm not going to deny it. But anyway, it was, to me, it was a fascinating story.
But I think he thought that it was related to the Iraq War, which he would.
Yeah. But that brings me to the current White House and the way in which A, no one seems to be speaking clearly for the president, and B, the message seems to be different every day. What's your assessment of the dysfunction in the current?
Well, I did a podcast back on February the 9th. The administration had only been in power for 2 weeks. And I was asked a question similar to that. And I said what I've already said here tonight, is that too many independent power centers in the White House. You need to have organization and structure. And you've got five separate power centers there with cross-cutting responsibilities, both across domestic and foreign policy. That's one problem. And another problem, I think, is probably the prioritization problem. I don't think I would have, unless I knew I had the votes for health care, I don't think I would have jumped off and made that my first deal. And you should, you would think you'd have the votes because Republicans control the House and the Senate. But you really, before we made that our number one priority, we should. So as I was mentioning to you, I think earlier tonight, I think infrastructure would have been something that if they kicked it off with infrastructure, they might have been able to get a few Democrats to join. That's something that Democrats are interested in. But they didn't, and now we're in this position of not really knowing whether we're going next with tax reform or whether we're going back to health care.
And I think this all comes back to the importance, how essential it is that a White House chief of staff prioritizes and is empowered. And it seems to me that every other modern president learns this lesson, often the hard way. It took Jimmy Carter 2.5 years to learn that he couldn't run the White House himself, and he appointed a chief of staff. Bill Clinton, it took him 1.5 years to figure out that he needed to empower a chief like Leon Panetta.
Right.
And do you see any evidence that this president has learned that lesson?
Yes, I think as difficulties mount, there's more incentive to try to remedy problems. And I think that's beginning to happen now, given the news reports you see. Yeah. But you have to empower. Somebody has to be the person that will decide who goes in the Oval Office, that will decide what the president does every day, what he says every day, to the extent that's possible with this president, which it may not be possible. So.
You have to want to have a grown-up in the room.
You said that. You said that.
On that note, I think it's probably time for questions. So anybody who would like to pose a question, please step up. Yeah.
Secretary, I want to focus on one day because I believe you were chief of staff serving the last time a president was shot. And could you take us through the events of that?
Sure. That was a very traumatic experience for us. We had only been there for a little over 1.5 months, I think. I can't remember the exact date President Reagan was shot, March sometime.
April 30, was it?
Was it? No. What? No. Anyway,
March
we
30.
hadn't been there very long, and I'm sitting in my office. The president's gone to give a speech to the trades unions down at the Washington Hilton. And Mike Deaver came in my office earlier that morning and said, "Hey, do you want me to take the trip?" I said, "Boy, that would be terrific." I said, "I got a ton of stuff I got to do here." And so I didn't go on the trip. And I was sitting in my office when David Gergen came running in. He was the staff secretary at the time, and said there are reports that there's a shooting down at where the president's speaking, but the president hadn't been hit. And then later on, we got word that the president had been hit. And Ed Meese came into my office, and we both commandeered a car, and then we went to the hospital where they'd taken the president. And it was a very dicey time. Of course, President Reagan never lost his sense of humor. He had the best sense of humor of anybody I've ever known. So, he refused to take any assistance in getting out of the car. He walked in the hospital on his own and collapsed right there in the vestibule of the hospital. And they put him on the gurney and started stripping his clothes off and found out he had indeed been shot. And that's when Nancy showed up there after a while, and he looked at her and he said, "Honey, I forgot to duck." He said, he looked at Ed Meese and Mike Deaver and I showed up, and he looked at us and said, "Who's minding the store?" He looked at the doctors and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." And here he was in grave danger of dying. He didn't almost die from the wound, and this was not well known at the time. We didn't make a big point of putting it out, but he got an infection later on during his recovery in the hospital, that was very serious. But he came through, and as a matter of fact, in an ironic way, that shooting, that attempted assassination, strengthened his political standing in the country. We were having trouble with our priority items, tax reductions and budget cuts. After he came back, he was such a hero. We got those things through fairly quickly with Democratic votes. And then during his presidency, and I'm really proud of this, and this is the way presidencies ought to work. We did reform Social Security by getting the top Democrat, Tip O'Neill, and the top Republican, Ronald Reagan, together, and both of them putting their shoulder to the wheel and agreeing they weren't going to take political potshots at the other on the basis of Social Security. And we got stuff done. We got it reformed. We restored the financial sovereignty of Social Security for 30 years. We also got tax reform in 1986, which is the only time it's ever really been done comprehensively. And that's why when this administration, the Secretary of the Treasury, whoever it was, said, "Oh, this will be good, we'll get this by August," I got a bridge. I got some land in Florida I'd like to make available to him. But we got stuff done. Why did we get stuff done? Because we had a leader who knew how to lead. He knew how to delegate. He held these views on big issues very viscerally. You didn't, smaller government, lower taxes, strong defense. But after that, he didn't care about all the minutia of who's scheduled on the White House tennis court the way Jimmy Carter did.
Reagan understood something that Carter never figured out, which is that an outsider president needs an insider chief of staff, and to make things work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hi there. My name's Ben Deal. I appreciate the opportunity to listen to y'all tonight. I guess the question I've got is around influence and the role that influence has with the president and the chief of staff, and then the chief of staff with the entire team. What did you see, Mr. Baker, as your key for influence within your position, both between the president and the staff?
What did I see what about the influence?
What was important for you in terms of holding influence with the staff and then also with the president?
Well, with the staff, you just have to be a good manager, and you have to have loyalty up and loyalty down. You have to have that with the president too. But that was one characteristic of all the presidents I served, whether it's Ford, Reagan, or Bush. There was always loyalty up and loyalty down as far as those presidents were concerned. We've talked here about how a president really should empower a chief of staff. In other words, give him influence, give him responsibility, give him authority. So that's all I know to say about influence. If you don't, in politics, if you don't have influence, you're out. You're a cipher. I mean, that's what politics is all about.
Yeah.
A related question. As chief of staff, how did you deal with the influence of family members who were advisors to the president?
Very carefully. You know, Donald Reagan hung up on the First Lady, hung up on Nancy Reagan. Somebody asked me, said, what do you think about that? I said, that's a hanging offense. Well, it was, and it cost him his job. But you have to be very aware of the fact that presidents have families and they have influence. And sometimes they have squirrely ideas. But Ronald Reagan's closest family member was my closest ally. She was why I was in that White House. And anytime we had something that was really tough with the President Reagan could be very hard-headed and obstinate at times. Oftentimes, we would enlist her to try and move him in a direction that we thought he might ought to go. She wouldn't do it unless she agreed, of course, and it didn't work all the time. But I can think of, like the Social Security thing is a very good example, the one that Chris mentioned. To get him off of that, we had to go to the First Lady and say, look, this would be devastating if we brought this up now. And she was very helpful in that.
And Michael,
Mike Deaver was really important because Mike was the closest staffer to the presidents personally. But family can be a real problem in campaigns. I led 5 presidential campaigns, and I never led one that I didn't have some problem with family, because they've got their own ideas about what ought to happen or what ought not to happen, and you have to dissuade them of that in a way that doesn't get you in trouble with the boss.
so I once asked Leslie Stahl, the CBS correspondent, why she thought Jim Baker and Nancy Reagan had such a great relationship. And she said, I think Nancy thought Jim was good looking.
Well, that's Leslie Stahl, who's pretty good looking herself.
Yes.
Thanks for having us. So much of your success came from the 5 Ps and planning ahead of time and knowing what your walk-away point was in negotiations. Was there ever a time you felt like you gave up too much to get a deal done?
Yeah, I'm sure there was. I'm trying to think of an example. We rarely left anything on the table, and we tried not to. One of the mistakes we made a bunch of mistakes. One of the mistakes we made was convincing the president that he should raise taxes in something called TEFRA. Here's what happened. We campaigned on a platform of reducing taxes by $500 billion. We got it done, but we got more than that done because we ended up in a competition with the Democrats to see who was going to cut taxes the most. And we ended up cutting them by $750 billion. And the Federal Reserve was going bonkers. The bond market was spiraling. It looked really bad economically. So we thought, well, we just need to pull it back down to $500 billion, so we'll just raise $200 billion in new taxes. And we had to convince the president, who was viscerally opposed to any new tax. And we finally convinced him with Nancy's help, but it was a mistake. He was right, I think, and we were wrong on TEFRA. That's not exactly leaving too much on the table, but it comes close.
Thanks.
My question is tied into the previous one. I was wondering if you could give some insights into your friendship with Nancy Reagan post-presidency and really up until the years before her death.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was always close to Nancy. There was only one time in all the years that the 4.5 years, 4 years plus that I was Chief of Staff, and the almost 4 years that I was Treasury Secretary, and in the re-elect in 1984, there was only one, and the debate stuff that I did for him in 1980. Only one time did she ever really feel out of sorts with me that I could tell was when President Reagan lost the first debate to Walter Mondale in the '84 election, he just got beat, and it was an embarrassing performance, and there were some people around like the national chairman of the party and
Paul Laxalt.
yeah, and others who thought, and Nancy, I think, who thought, well, we got to be able to point to somebody. This couldn't have been the president's fault, so we got to have somebody. So they came to me and they said, we want you to fire Dick Darman for brutalizing the president in the preparation process for the debate. I said, wait a minute. I said, we prepared him in exactly the same way we did in the 80 debates in which he did so well. And the president had gone out, the press had said, why did you forget your clothes and all that? And he said, well, that was just me, I didn't study, and he took the responsibility. But the others wanted me to fire Dick Darman, and I said, I'm not going to fire Dick Darman until the president tells me to fire Dick Darman. And I knew he would never tell me to fire Dick Darman, because he would never tell anybody to fire anyone. That's the kind of person he was. He was all about hope and opportunity and optimism, and not about cutting people's throats when they didn't deserve it. So that's the only time in that whole length of time that I was associated with her that there was ever any tension that I could detect in our relationship. And as you know, I was honored that she asked me to give a eulogy for her when she died.
On that note, I'm getting the signal that we are unfortunately out of time. I hope you'll all stay and buy a book. But anyway, it's really been a privilege to be here with you.
Thank you.